Everybody, I am so excited. I'm here with Gunther Weil, and he is leading our next Beyond Performance webinar on April 13th. I've asked Gunther to join me just to kind of give you some sneak peeks of what we're about to talk about. And I couldn't be more excited. So again, Gunther, thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
So Gunther, just give us a quick background on you to start.
Well, professionally, I'm a psychologist by training. I got my PhD at Harvard in 1964. I was introduced early on to the psychedelics at Harvard. I was part of that so-called Harvard Psychedelic Project with Tim Leary and Richard Alpert, aka Ram Dass. And I was one of 3 graduate students, part of that scene, if you will. So that really affected the course of my personal and professional trajectory for many, many years. And interestingly enough, with the so-called psychedelic renaissance, it's sort of coming full circle. Over the years, I've served in academic institutions. I've started and run a number of consulting and coaching firms over the years. And for the last 20 years or so, I have focused on human values and human worldviews as a kind of key to productivity, to success, measured not only in terms of traditional ideas about achievement and performance, but looking more holistically for many, many years now on really what constitutes a successful life, which clearly includes, financial and professional goals. But there are many other elements that need to be looked at. And one of the things I very much like about our collaboration, JP, is your keen interest in a more kind of fulfilled and so-called, for lack of a better word, more holistic emphasis as we move beyond performance, including but beyond performance. So I've worked actively now for many years as a coach and consultant with a variety of organizations and leaders in many different market verticals. I've continued to develop the IP, so to speak, of underlying the values methodology and the model and a variety of different assessments that we have developed. And by the way, the one we're going to be working with closely on April 13th is a more abbreviated version of a longer assessment that is designed for larger rollouts, if you will. It's designed for scale. And I'll go into that in a little more detail on April 13th, but suffice it to say for the moment that we'll be deploying that assessment that evening. And part of the homework for that evening, prior to the evening, is for anyone who registers they'll be offered that assessment to take it, and a little bit of homework around that to help smooth the entry or the portal into that evening. So the long and short of it is I've worked for many years now, and as I say, working with leaders and organizations of all types. And I'm very eager to explore how now we can move to the next phase of this work to bring it to more people, to scale it, if you will.
And Gunther, part of my mission is to inspire and to activate and to enable these leaders. And you've been a great part of our community already, and you've seen that there's artists and special forces operators and athletes and entrepreneurs and funders. So if there's one thing to get them to commit to not just showing up, but to take the assessment, what would you tell them?
I think that, to put it bluntly, pure transparency, that if you're not motivated to take the assessment, then you really probably shouldn't sign up for the event. Which doesn't mean you won't get some value out of the value focus, but your participation and investment will be largely enriched, very significantly enriched by doing that homework assignment. We'll be doing more interactive stuff in the course of breakout rooms and stuff on the 13th, but the transition into the 13th is very important. Beginnings are really important. The kind of looking at sort of the metaphor of the first note of an octave. You want to hit that note squarely. You want that resonance of that note to carry on, to help bring the momentum into what will be engaged with on the 13th.
Now, I've heard many stories about all the different careers and almost lives you've had, but tell me about when you started this and why did you then dedicate your life's work to this? I mean, you could have done anything. And I'm just curious why this was so important.
Well, I think my wheelhouse, as I reflect on my life, my wheelhouse has, with a few exceptions, when I kind of explored other professions, like I had a 10-year stint in the music business, for example, and earlier on in my life, I had, many years of experience working in academia. But I think the main impetus for my professional work now for at least 15 or 20 years has been the exploration of human values. And I got to that through working with leadership teams and C-suites and organizations of all types internationally in many different markets, including finance, healthcare, the field of coaching and consulting itself, executive search and recruitment, marketing, just a whole range of areas. And what I discovered in those engagements, working with senior teams on strategy, on organizational development, was at a certain point in those engagements, you're always focusing, or usually focusing, on values, the values of that organization or the values of that team. And historically, most organizations have paid lip service to that. Some have taken it seriously, most don't. But over the course of many years, as I was doing that, I would walk out of these planning sessions or strategic sessions with a sense of deja vu, of familiarity, that I had been there, done that. We had talked about the same things, and that the values most of the time that people were talking about or disclosing, so to speak, were values that they considered to be aspirational or would like to have, or probably even more significantly were considered to be kind of politically correct within that organization versus the actual values that they were carrying. So that forced me to stop for a couple of years and to look into the research on values in the field of psychology and organizational development, and look for some methodology or a methodology that could actually assess the actual values of individuals and teams and organizations or communities. And one thing led to another. I'm not going to go to those details now, but one thing led to another, finally to the acquisition of a IP and the development of a model and a methodology and a IT platform, basically, that continues to be, all of these things continue to be developed in the best sense of R&D, that I'm working with now for many years, continue to work with, and which I'll be sharing elements of that on April 13th. Now we have limited time together, 2 hours. We'll take a deep dive, but nevertheless, I can only cover certain aspects of the methodology and the model and the assessment in the course of that.
So we're here. We are in front of hopefully my entire network is watching this, and again, it's the head of innovation at Under Armour to the person who's running human performance at SOCOM and USASOC, to the MBA folks, to across the sector. So what's the ... like why? What's the value here? Because I don't think it comes, the idea to say you should take your values, know your values, it doesn't translate. I think it's obvious to you, but I don't think it's obvious to other people, because maybe to what you said before, they've never thought that as the gateway to something. What is this the gateway to?
My belief, which is based on 20 or more years of working in this field, if you will, or with this focus, is that human values are, they're like a universal currency that allow people from many different perspectives and ideologies and persuasions and disciplines and skill sets to have a conversation that's grounded in their life experience, in their own sincerity, in their own capacity to host intentional and purposeful conversations, whatever the outcomes may be. For an organizational leader, a CEO, what often keeps them up at night is the question, do I have the right people in place to deliver on my promises? And having the right people in place is frankly beyond the level of the, I'm assuming, relatively high bar of their competence and experience, which is a given. Any significant, informed leader knows that. I mean, frankly, that's the easy part, basically, is to kind of do the due diligence on competence. The real question is, do I have the right people in place vis-a-vis their capacity to work together, to align around a common vision and a set of strategies, and a capacity to host a level of emotional intelligence and teamwork, at the same time to honor the capacity for an individual's contribution, and to find the balance of the kind of individual rainmaker and the team effort, which is a very interesting and shifting boundary. All of these particular perspectives I'm describing right now, I believe, are based on an understanding of my own values, the values of my team members, and the values of the whole organization, as characterized or driven by the senior leaders of the organization, or the executive team, but in some cases also by driving that assessment down into the whole organization. And I've had some experiences in doing that as well.
So let's talk about some of those experiences. Do you have something that comes to mind that was maybe an elite, high potential performer? It could be either in business or in research or even in government, operationally, that this changed the game for them in a way?
Yeah, there are a number of examples. I had a 8 or 9 year, depending on your count, engagement with the MIT Media Lab, where I was brought in originally to look at how the leadership team, the administrative management leadership team of that academic group could be enhanced to serve the vision and mission of the director at that time, who came in as a new director to launch, basically, relaunch the Media Lab, which was an organization that had kind of laid fallow for a number of years. It had a storied history going back many years, but under different directors, in different time periods, there were periods of what I'm calling now kind of fallow periods. So that was a very interesting engagement where I was able to work with senior faculty of many different disciplines, including AI, including synthetic biology, civic media, many different foci, because the Media Lab had always been a very intentionally structured, multidisciplinary organization, very much feeding off the kind of principle you were describing at the very beginning, JP, where you're talking about Black Lab and having a diverse community of skill sets and interest, and the synergies that can arise through that. So I've also worked, for example, with the senior management team at American Express in the open business card division some years ago. It was a couple of year engagement working to align the senior team around the vision and mission of the director of that group. I forgot her title exactly. Wasn't a CEO, but really a director of that division, which turned out finally to wasn't the largest division within Amex, but it was the most profitable. And so that was a very interesting engagement, also working at that level. I've had other engagements working at Harvard University with a group there that had focused on a new model of fundraising and philanthropy. That was a multi-year engagement as well. Working with Jennifer McCrae, who was the founder of that particular organization, who is now working on her own, and I continue to work with her to advance that particular model of fundraising around what I call a collaborative model, a generative model rather than a traditional top-down, power-driven, hierarchical model of philanthropy.
Yeah. Well, I think this is really helpful. So one of the things that, like, my very first takeaway personally, when you went through mine, you were telling me about my values, but also my root values, my foundational. And you talked about how sometimes those actually can get you in trouble, or to be careful about them. So there's a yin yang to all these values.
Yes.
And that was really informative to me, because I hadn't seen the world, and it caught me in it helped me see a blind spot that I was maybe too tolerant in certain areas. And so I'm wondering, as you're thinking through some of these examples, is there anything that, is kind of almost that first step when people walk through it, like an individual, John Doe, will just say his name is, that all of a sudden there's this aha moment. And because they went through this process, it's pretty typical someone's going to see that aha moment.
Yes, let me try to address that. One of the things that I mentioned earlier in this conversation was the idea that people often usually don't actually even know their values. The values that they've taken on often have been kind of what I call hand-me-down values from the culture, or from their upbringing, their family of origin, or
Right.
the last organization they've worked for or working for, where they've internalized a set of values that may or may not actually be their own. And so one of the first things we look at when someone, for example, takes a value assessment is it forces them to prioritize their actual values. And there is no single ideal outcome, which would portend or support a desire to kind of fake it, if you will, or to impress anyone. It just doesn't work that way. So a fundamental point here is that people don't know their values, and they don't know the range of their values. And generally, folks have around 10 or 15 values that are important, and of those, maybe 5 to 10 that are really significant. And so what the values assessment does, what I'm calling here the KVI, the key values inventory, is that it identifies those values. Now, another module in the data that people will be receiving, in the reports they'll be receiving when they take the KVI, is a chart basically of what I call their foundation, focus, and vision values. And the foundation values are the values that generally have been with them for most of their life, because their origin is in early childhood and their family, and also significant experiences they've had along the way, both traumatic and actually very generative. So both sides of the coin are presented there. And in exploring those foundation values in the data, what we've come to realize is that they're a two-edged sword. They represent a strength in that they form they help form a sense of identity, a sense of who I believe I am, basically, my personality, and deeper than my personality, more kind of often an essential aspect. And then as well, they can represent a blind spot, as you mentioned that word a few minutes ago, because when those values in the foundation are being challenged, for example, if I have financial security as a value in my foundation, and I'm going through a rough period financially, that forces me to kind of reorder my focus and my vision. I've got to take care of the foundation, basically. Now, there are many different values that can show up in the foundation, including things like care and nurture, or status or image, or any number of other kind of values. And by the way, there are 64 values that we identify within the key values model. So identifying those foundation values can help us realize that when those are being tested or being challenged and I'm having a rough time, it can point to reordering my priorities of what I have to focus on in order to reestablish the foundation. It's like building a home. You have to have a good foundation in order, to raise the levels, if you will. And the same analogy applies here, that you have to have a strong foundation. You have to have an awareness of your foundational values and how they're being lived or how they're being enjoyed in order to be able to, in my belief, in order to be able to be effective and successful. Now, there's more to it than that, but
yeah. So what's coming up for me? So Gunther, thank you for being here. I think we live in this time right now of accelerating change. Technology is obviously driving that. The exponential technologies in front of us. Obviously, we're having a growing gap in both wealth and also values in general across the world. And so it can be a very trying, but also time. And I think values trying to both bridge that gap back, but also what I'm hearing is that what you're doing is a couple of things. First of all, with your knowledge and with your science-based methodologies, our audience is going to first get a tool, an assessment to actually do the search inside and learn about themselves. Then they're going to get a so what? What does this mean? How do I interpret it? And how should I then try to observe it or bring it into my life? And then third is, so then what do I do from here with not just me, but my family unit and my cohorts? Is that how we should set up the time for us in a couple of weeks?
Sure, I believe that would be a good template.
Do you have a story that you could just lead us through? And it could even be me, but like an example of somebody who just that first session after they took their KVI or AVI, but their KVI, and they delve into it. Can you give us a real life story about what happened to that individual?
I've worked with so many people over so many years where that, I would say that has been, I don't want to say the norm, but generally almost everyone that I work with has the experience of greater clarity, and which is interesting because the clarity is not always associated with a aha moment. Okay, it's not like suddenly there's an enormous epiphany and they discover something they didn't know. It's not that. It's kind of revisiting what is already known, but not fully conscious, and often not subject to clarity and to confidence. And so one of the real outcomes that I've seen repeatedly, and I'm generalizing now, is that people, when they go through this process, particularly the in-depth coaching, okay, that they come to a realization of what they need to do next in order to live their values more fully. The kind of byline, if you will, on my masthead reads sort of like living your values. What else matters, basically? So the emphasis here is on living your values, not just the diagnostic, not just the exchange with facilitators and with peers, but what am I doing with the knowledge that I gained through this assessment and through the values clarification process? How do I set that in motion so that I'm actually able to deploy that in a more purposeful way? So does that address your point without giving you a specific example?
That's great.
That's
great. Let's see, anything else I wanted to ask? I mean, Gunther, you did such a nice job going through it.
So generally, when I begin an organizational engagement, it generally happens at the CEO level, generally through a one-on-one coaching, mentoring engagement. And at that point, it's not uncommon that an organizational leader, a CEO, or occasionally a CTO or a CFO that I'll work with will then, make an assessment that they'd like to bring this work to their team, if you will, to their senior team. And so generally it works that way. Rarely, if ever, at one or two occasions over the course of a lot of years, have I come into the matrix through HR, because typically HR doesn't have the budget or the internal cultural or political clout to mount this kind of initiative.
Right.
Now, having said that, at a point relatively soon in the engagement, there needs to be a partnership with HR. Sometimes that can be tricky because often HR groups have the work on the assumption that if it ain't created here, it ain't any good. So that's one of the interesting challenges of working at scale, if you will, organizationally. But the process basically is initially working with the C-suite or a leader in the C-suite, branching it out to the executive team. Occasionally, then it'll go to a couple more levels. That's what happened with Amex, basically, starting with a senior, with the CEO or the director of that particular division, and then moving to her team, and then moving to the next 75 senior executives, basically. That's how far we went down into that organizational chart. The process is that everyone takes the assessment. Everybody is given a report. There is a coaching, mentoring engagement for each of those individuals, generally at the senior team level, so that I have a working knowledge of those individuals, their beliefs, their assumptions, their worldviews, their values. I can begin to identify their values as potential leading indicators of potential conflict or misalignment, as well as in many cases, there are post indicators as well as leading indicators of existing conflict. But having that initial engagement individually is very important, so that when we convene the first initial offsite or meeting of the executive team, I already have a working knowledge of the culture and the politics of the organization, some of the landmines and blind spots that may be operating. Then what we do is we develop a composite report, a group report or team or organizational report that has a number of different modules that basically maps the shared values of, let's say, the leadership team. And that report and that data then becomes the basis for a series of meetings and ongoing conversations, both formal and informal, but which are structured to some extent, the informal ones, around how the organization can begin to implement the empirically measured values within a number of different outcomes. And those outcomes might include strategic planning, they could include budgeting, they could include hiring or firing, they could include new product development, they could include social environmental responsibility, which is a growing aspect, diversity. There are a number of different, I would say almost an endless number of applications that the values can be directed towards, because that is the nature of values. It cuts through all of the content areas, basically. So the key question for that organization, if they have the interest and the self-discipline and the willingness to explore this seriously, and not just in terms of going to get lip service or the latest shiny thing that's coming through the HR office, is, are we committed to living these values in everything we do? Not the least of which
It's
is,
powerful.
for example, how this informs our customer service, or what I prefer to call at different times and have called our customer intimacy, if you will. Going beyond customer service as sort of like a commodity, which has become more or less, at least the bar has been raised to some extent there, but going much deeper than that, to engaging with our, with our clients, our customers, to help us identify how we can serve them better. And I've had in one instance, for example, very significant one working with Amex, where using a different tool, a valve scan tool, which is a tool we developed over the years to assess the values in narrative. whether they're stories or websites or speeches or whatever kind of document, or electronic or written document, to look at that, what values are being communicated by that. So I did a project with Amex along those lines where we looked at the so-called black card, Amex black card, which you remember JP, or still is,
Sure.
is sort of like it's a high status card within Amex. It costs, I think, a minimum of 25 grand a year. And you kind of have to be selected by Amex for it. So
Right.
it's a very rarefied group.
High fidelity. Yeah. Yeah.
And so I was able to work with about, they ended up with 60 to 75 black card holders utilizing data that Amex provided me with focus groups and customer service calls, which were transcribed, and using the Val scan to look at what kind of values are being communicated between Amex and their clients. And then we began to look at how we could help shape Amex's advertising to reflect those values, because interestingly enough, most of the values for this very kind of high status group weren't focused particularly on achievement or performance. They had to do with themes around creativity, innovation, social justice, environmental justice, all kinds of interesting things, because most of these folks had already achieved a very high level of financial and professional success. And so we began to explore how we could diversify Amex's advertising to reflect the values of their actual customers. And again, working with that initial group.
Now, if you want to know more about Gunther, we've included a couple of links just below with one of his podcasts and some other really interesting history. So take a listen. But Gunther, you've created this amazing platform around assessing your values, learning about them, and then deploying them not just for yourself, but your organizations. Tell us, what should we expect out of this? Like, somebody who's thinking about joining and taking this assessment, what's the expectation? What's the value prop?
Anyone who joins this exploration on the 13th will receive a report of empirically derived of their actual values. There'll be a couple of modules involved in that, which will provide some very interesting and important insights into how those values are derived and how they may or may not be lived for you. There'll be an opportunity to explore in quite some depth how what we need to do in order to repurpose, if you will, or live those values in whatever professional or personal context we want to identify that we're currently facing, that we may be challenged by, or we may have some ambivalence about, or and those could include things, for example, like transitions, career changes. There are a number of different interesting life situations that we're going to be looking at in that context.
Yeah, that's great. Now, you guys all know me. I am always about purpose. You hear me talk about it all the time. Ever since I've met Gunther, though, I believe that purpose is ultimately defined, and you can't even really understand it unless you understand your values. This is probably the single most important forum that we're putting on. I really hope you join us in person, well, virtually in person. Take the assessment, get the most out of it, and be part of our community. Gunther, anything else to add?
Let me give you one other piece here. So from the perspective that I'm speaking now, from the values perspective, identifying purpose is not really possible without understanding your values. So purpose, the sense of purpose, is informed and driven and guided by my values. So the working assumption here, the prerequisite, if you will, is that I need to know my values. And so I need to really have confidence that the values that I believe that I have are actually my own values, not something that's just been carried down from the past or absorbed, or that I think is important for me to be accepted by other people. There's a requirement here that I have a direct knowledge, empirically based, of my own values. And if I'm going to be able to actually live my purpose. Now that's a piece of it. The other part of that, of course, is having the willpower, if you will, to live those values. So that's another dimension we're going to be looking at, as well as the capabilities or skills I have. So there are three legs to this school: purpose, will, and capability. And those have to kind of harmonize together and form a unity, a kind of trinity or a unity, in order to be able to mobilize my energy and my will and my sense of purpose based on my values, in order for me to deliver on the promises I make to myself, or I make to my colleagues or teams, or to the public.
If you're committed to well-being for yourself, for your teams, for your cohorts, this is the foundational element. So we look forward to seeing you then.